Korean War, June 25, 1950, July 27, 1953, was an armed conflict on the Korean Peninsula fought between North Korea, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, and South Korea, Republic of Korea, ROK, and their allies. North Korea was supported by China and the Soviet Union, while South Korea was supported by the United Nations led by the United States under the auspices of the United Nations Command, UNC. The conflict was one of the first major proxy wars of the Cold War and one of its deadliest conflicts on non-combatants, especially civilians. It is estimated that 1.5 to 3 million Korean civilians were killed during the war. The Korean War was the first time the United Nations Security Council, UNSC, authorized the use of military force under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. After the end of World War II in 1945, Korea, which had been a Japanese colony for 35 years, was divided by the Soviet Union and the United States into two occupation zones at the 38th parallel, with plans for a future independent state. Due to political disagreements, the zones formed their own governments in 1948. North Korea was led by Kim Il-sung in Pyongyang, and South Korea by Syngman Rhee in Seoul. Both claimed to be the sole legitimate government of all of Korea. On June 25, 1950, the Korean People's Army, KPA, equipped and trained by the Soviets, launched an invasion of the South. In the absence of the Soviet Union's representative, the UN Security Council denounced the attack and called on member nations to provide military assistance to repel the invasion. The United Nations forces under the UN command comprised 21 countries, with the US providing around 90% of military personnel. On June 27, 1950, President Harry S. Truman ordered U.S. air and sea forces to aid South Korea. Seoul was captured by the KPA on 28 June, and by early August, the Republic of Korea Army, ROKA, and its allies were nearly defeated, holding on to only the Pusan Perimeter in the peninsula's southeast. On 15 September, UN forces landed at Inchon near Seoul, cutting off KPA troops and supply lines. UN forces broke out from the perimeter on 18 September, recaptured Seoul, and invaded North Korea in October, capturing Pyongyang and advancing towards the Yalu River, the border with China. On 19 October, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, PVA, crossed the Yalu and entered the war on the side of the North. UN forces retreated from North Korea in December, following the PVA's first and second offensive. Communist forces captured Seoul again in January 1951 before losing it to a UN counteroffensive 2 months later. After an abortive Chinese spring offensive, UN forces retook territory roughly up to the 38th parallel. Armistice negotiations began in July 1951, but the fighting continued until 1953. The war ended inconclusively, with the Korean Demilitarized Zone established, and both sides suffering heavy casualties.
Operation Pakbong began at 4:40 a.m. on the 25th of June 1950, when the KPA crossed the 38th parallel behind artillery fire. They claimed ROK troops attacked first, aiming to arrest Syngman Rhee. Fighting started on the Inchon Peninsula. Some reports suggested a South Korean counterattack at Haeju, but these claims were disputed. The KPA attacked along the 38th parallel with tanks and heavy artillery, while the ROK lacked such resources. The South Koreans were quickly routed. On the 27th of June, Rhee evacuated Seoul. The ROK destroyed the Hanggang Bridge to stop the KPA, killing hundreds of refugees. Seoul fell on the 28th of June, and some South Korean officials pledged allegiance to the North. Rhee ordered the massacre of suspected political opponents. By early July, the ROK's forces were severely diminished and placed under U.S. command. In June 1950, President Truman ordered U.S. troops to Korea without congressional authority. The Truman administration was unprepared, as Korea was not part of the strategic Asian defense perimeter. Concerns about Japan's security influenced the decision to intervene. The U.S. feared the Korean War could escalate into a global conflict. The UN approved the use of force to aid South Korea. The Truman administration was uncertain if the attack was a Soviet ploy. The decision to send ground troops was made after confirming the Soviet Union would not retaliate. Truman believed unchecked aggression would encourage further communist actions. This decision set a precedent for executive military action without congressional approval. On the
25th of June 1950, the United Nations Security Council unanimously condemned the North Korean invasion of South Korea with Resolution 82. The Soviet Union, a veto-wielding power, had boycotted Security Council meetings since January 1950, protesting Taiwan's occupation of China's permanent seat. On the 27th of June, the Security Council published Resolution 83 recommending its member states provide military assistance to South Korea to restore international peace, resulting in a US-led coalition. President Truman signing a proclamation declaring a national emergency and authorizing US entry into the Korean War. On the 4th of July, the Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister accused the United States of starting armed intervention on behalf of South Korea. The Soviet Union challenged the legitimacy of the war for several reasons. The ROC intelligence upon which Resolution 83 was based came from US intelligence. North Korea was not invited as a sitting temporary member of the UN, which violated Article 32 of the UN Charter, and the fighting was beyond the Charter's scope, because the initial North-South border fighting was classed as a civil war. Because the Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council, some legal scholars posited that deciding upon this type of action required the unanimous vote of all 5 permanent members. On the 7th of July, the Security Council set up under the sponsorship of the British and French sides a unified command structure which was authorized to fly the blue flag of the UN but was not subject in any way to UN orders. Within days of the invasion, masses of ROC soldiers, of dubious loyalty to the Syngman Rhee regime, were retreating southwards or defecting en masse to the northern side, the KPA. United States response, July-August 1950. As soon as word of the attack was received, Acheson informed Truman that the North Koreans had invaded South Korea. Truman and Acheson discussed a US invasion response and agreed the US was obligated to act, comparing the North Korean invasion with Adolf Hitler's aggressions in the 1930s, and the mistake of appeasement must not be repeated. US industries were mobilized to supply materials, labor, capital, production facilities, and other services necessary to support the military objectives of the Korean War. Truman later explained he believed fighting the invasion was essential to the containment of communism as outlined in the National Security Council Report 68, NSC 68. Communism was acting in Korea, just as Hitler, Mussolini and the Japanese had 10, 15, and 20 years earlier. I felt certain that if South Korea was allowed to fall, communist leaders would be emboldened to override nations closer to our own shores. If the communists were permitted to force their way into the Republic of Korea without opposition from the free world, no small nation would have the courage to resist threats and aggression by stronger communist neighbors. In August 1950, Truman and Acheson obtained the consent of Congress to appropriate $12 billion for military action, equivalent to $161 billion in 2025. Because of the extensive defense cuts and emphasis on building a nuclear bomber force, none of the services were able to make a robust response with conventional military strength. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was faced with deploying a force that was a shadow of its World War II counterpart. Acting on Acheson's recommendation, Truman ordered MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allied powers in Japan, to transfer material to the South Korean military, while giving air cover to evacuation of US nationals. Truman disagreed with advisors who recommended unilateral bombing of the North Korean forces and ordered the US 7th Fleet to protect Taiwan, whose government asked to fight in Korea. The US denied Taiwan's request for combat, lest it provokes retaliation from the PRC. Because the US had sent the 7th Fleet to neutralize the Taiwan Strait, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai criticized the UN and US initiatives as armed aggression on Chinese territory. The US supported the Kuomintang in Burma in the hope these KMT forces would harass China from the southwest, thereby diverting Chinese resources from Korea.
There were numerous atrocities and massacres of civilians throughout the Korean War committed by both sides, starting in the war's first days. In 2005 to 2010, the South Korean Truth and Reconciliation Commission investigated atrocities and other human rights violations through much of the 20th century, from the Japanese colonial period through the Korean War and beyond. It excavated some mass graves from the Bodo League massacres and confirmed the general outlines of those political executions. Of the Korean War-era massacres the Commission was petitioned to investigate, 82% were perpetrated by South Korean forces, with 18% perpetrated by North Korean forces. The Bodo League massacres were the mass killings of alleged communists by South Korean forces in the summer of 1950 following North Korea's invasion. The commission was able to verify 4,934 execution victims in these massacres, but historians estimate that at least 60,000 people were killed, with estimates reaching 200,000. The most well-known North Korean massacre was the Seoul National University Hospital massacre on the 28th of June 1950, where over 1,000 patients and wounded soldiers were killed by North Korean soldiers. The commission also received petitions alleging more than 200 large-scale killings of South Korean civilians by the U.S. military during the war, mostly air attacks. It confirmed several such cases, including refugees crowded into a cave attacked with napalm bombs, which survivors said killed 360 people, and an air attack that killed 197 refugees gathered in a field in the far south. It recommended South Korea seek reparations from the United States, but in 2010, a reorganized commission under a new, conservative government concluded that most U.S. mass killings resulted from military necessity, while in a small number of cases, they concluded, the U.S. military had acted with low levels of unlawfulness, but the commission recommended against seeking reparations. The UN bombing of North Korea during the Korean War has been condemned as a war crime by various authors. Historian Bruce Cummings has stated, "What hardly any Americans know or remember is that we carpet-bombed the North for 3 years with next to no concern for civilian casualties." Scholar Sar Conway Lance has stated that, during the war, American military and civilian officials stretched the term military target to include virtually all human-made structures, capitalizing on the vague distinction between the military and civilian segments of an enemy society. They came to apply the logic of total war to the destruction of the civil infrastructure in North Korea. Almost a half-century after the Korean War, on the 29th of September 1999, a team of Associated Press, AP, journalists reported that a dozen ex-American GI soldiers had confirmed that U.S. forces killed large numbers of civilian refugees in July 1950, up to 400 according to Korean villagers, mostly women, children, and elderly persons.
North Korea. As a result of the war, North Korea had been virtually destroyed as an industrial society. After the Armistice, Kim Il-sung requested Soviet economic and industrial assistance. In September 1953, the Soviet government agreed to cancel or postpone repayment for all outstanding debts and promised to grant North Korea 1 billion rubles in monetary aid, industrial equipment, and consumer goods. Eastern European members of the Soviet bloc also contributed with logistical support, technical aid, and medical supplies. China canceled North Korea's war debts, provided 800 million yuan, promised trade cooperation, and sent in thousands of troops to rebuild damaged infrastructure. Contemporary North Korea remains underdeveloped and continues to be a totalitarian dictatorship since the end of the war, with an elaborate cult of personality around the Kim dynasty. Present-day North Korea follows Songun, or military-first policy, and has the highest number of military and paramilitary personnel in the world, with 7,769,000 active, reserve, and paramilitary personnel, or approximately 30% of its population. Its active duty army of 1.28 million is the fourth largest in the world, after China, the United States, and India, consisting of 4.9% of its population. North Korea possesses nuclear weapons. A 2014 UN inquiry into abuses of human rights in North Korea concluded that the gravity, scale, and nature of these violations reveal a state that does not have any parallel in the contemporary world, with Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch holding similar views. South Korea. Post-war recovery was different in the two Koreas. South Korea, which started from a far lower industrial base than North Korea, stagnated in the first post-war decade. In 1953, South Korea and the United States signed a mutual defense treaty. South Korean anti-Americanism after the war was fueled by the presence and behavior of United States Forces Korea military personnel and U.S. support for Park's authoritarian regime, a fact still evident during the country's democratic transition in the 1980s. However, anti-Americanism has declined significantly in South Korea in recent years, making South Korea one of the most pro-U.S. countries. A large number of mixed-race GI babies were filling up the country's orphanages. Because Korean traditional society places significant weight on paternal family ties, bloodlines, and purity of race, children of mixed race or those without fathers are not easily accepted in South Korean society. International adoption of Korean children began in 1954. The U.S. Immigration Act of 1952 legalized the naturalization of non-blacks and non-whites as U.S. citizens and made possible the entry of military spouses and children from South Korea. With the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965, Koreans became one of the fastest-growing Asian groups in the United States. United States, the indelible meaning of the war for Americans was the unprecedented and new American military-industrial complex that arose in the 1950s. The United States spent US $30 billion on the Korean War. China, Mao Zedong's decision to take on the United States was a direct attempt to confront what the communist bloc viewed as the strongest anti-communist power in the world, undertaken at a time when the Chinese communist regime was still consolidating its own power. Mao supported intervention not to save North Korea, but because he believed that a military conflict with the U.S. was inevitable after the U.S. entered the war, and to appease the Soviet Union to secure military dispensation and achieve Mao's goal of making China a major world military power. Mao was equally ambitious in improving his own prestige inside the communist international community. In his later years, Mao believed that Stalin only gained a positive opinion of him after China's entrance into the Korean War. Inside mainland China, the war improved the long-term prestige of Mao, Zhou, and Peng, allowing the Chinese Communist Party to increase its legitimacy while weakening anti-communist dissent. The Chinese government has encouraged the viewpoint that the war was initiated by the United States and South Korea, though Comintern documents have shown that Mao sought approval from Stalin to enter the war. In Chinese media, the Chinese war effort is considered as an example of China's engaging the strongest power in the world with an under-equipped army, forcing it to retreat, and fighting it.
If you enjoyed this video, please take a quick look at these analytics. 90% of you who watch this are not subscribed, and 1% of you are. So if you enjoyed the video made this far, please subscribe and watch another one. Thank you.